right, welcome to the Happy Teacher Pod, episode. Go on, Jenny. I can't
Oh God,
remember what episode
10. No, 10? 9. Episode 9.
Episode 9. Welcome back. Today we're going to be having 2 more guests. Yay! Jenny, do you want to introduce our guests today?
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So today we have Claire and Flo. So I know Claire and Flo because they are 2 of the chapter authors of the book that I helped write as well. So that is the MTPT project, and it's called A Guide to Parenting, Teaching and Creating Family-Friendly Schools. In some bookshops, but online. So we will put the link in the show notes. Brilliant. And if you don't have it already, it is missing from your life. So I urge you to buy it.
Yeah, me and Jenny are definitely all for the family-friendly schools or life-friendly schools. We spoke with Emma a couple of episodes ago about how life-friendly, sorry, I'm flying my screen, how life-friendly schools are really important, but schools are not always life friendly, unfortunately. So we do think it's an important thing to keep raising and talking about. So we normally start off with a little bit of a funny kind of tidbit, and me and Jenny were talking earlier and we were like, oh, have we got any funny pregnancy/parenting stories? And I just thought of this story that when I was I was pregnant with my first child, and I'd had 3 miscarriages. So I was like not going to tell people at school for a really long time. So I was like worried about, just everything. And so I kept going into school, and my line manager at the time, he kept having this golden syrup porridge. And it was like a really strong smell. And for anyone that's been pregnant before, like sometimes you can get really bad smell aversions. And I just kept walking into the staff room in the morning going, oh my God, who is eating this horrible smelling food? And he didn't know I was pregnant. And he was like, anyway, after a few days, he got a bit offended, and he was just like, well, not offended, but he was like, oh, I don't want to stink out the staff room anymore. I better stop eating this golden syrup porridge. And so he changed his breakfast to something non-smelly, like a bagel or something like that. And months later I was like, I'm really sorry I stopped you eating your lovely golden syrup breakfast, but it was just something about that smell that just made me feel physically sick every morning walking into the staff room. And he never had it again, so I feel really sorry.
Still. You've put him off.
Yeah, lucky he was a very good friend and he didn't take any offence to it. I think I would have if someone was kept telling me my breakfast smelled really bad. Bad smelling breakfast. I don't know why I had such an aversion.
There's certain smells to it, don't they? Because then we started reminiscing. So Roxy and I used to work together in the same school, and I was pregnant with my first pregnancy there. And I remember I used to just sit in the workroom in the corner of the floor, just on the floor. I didn't want to sit on a chair, and I would just sit there eating seaweed. And I just couldn't really get through the day unless I'd just gone through my pack of seaweed.
It was a healthy food snack for pregnancy. Yeah. But yeah, no, Jenny is the queen of snacks anyway. So in pregnancy,
snacks
definitely happens.
Yeah, I was recalling at a different school, and this was a private school, so I guess maybe they had an extra budget, but I used to have regular emails with the catering manager, and he would always check if there were enough cream eggs in stock for me, and if there wasn't, he'd buy a whole extra box of cream eggs for me. A little bit demanding.
Jenny,
there we go.
Spoiled with this.
I was a little bit spoiled with the snack. I just thought this is the chance, isn't it, when you're pregnant, just to call on the pregnancy privileges and just get what you can from a school. When you need food, you need food. When you need a cream egg, you need a cream egg.
Didn't you say to the school that we worked at together about feeding you at any time of day while you were pregnant?
Yeah, I might have just walked into the kitchen at any time of the day and just asked for a snack. I was sick a lot of the time, and the only thing that helped was very regular feeds.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. I can vouch for that one as well. But anyway, going on to our episode today, Jenny, do you wanna start us off
Yeah, so Claire wrote one of the chapters, which was all about planning for parenthood in all its different forms. It's a really interesting read. I would urge people to have a read of it. So the first question is, how can men and women become victims of discrimination?
Okay, so discrimination is one of those things that it's quite hard to prove direct discrimination, especially in the case of pregnancy and maternity, because an example of direct discrimination would be something like a teacher being told that they didn't get the job because they were pregnant and they were looking for someone who could be in post for the start of the new academic year.
Mm.
And employers aren't silly enough to say those kinds of things. That wouldn't be the reason that someone was given. So direct discrimination is quite hard to prove. There might be sort of something more subtle, like if a staff member's due to go on parental leave, they might get told, oh, you don't need to come to this training session because this is about something that's being put into place in September and you won't be here. I mean, if that staff member would usually attend that training, then that's discriminatory behaviour. And it's important to remember that all genders can be affected by discrimination. So pregnancy and maternity discrimination is really, really specific in the timeframes. So in the book, we outline all of the legal framework behind that. But there are also other forms of discrimination under the Equality Act. So sex discrimination, for example, can be faced by men and women. And that's one that would often be relied on if there was something that wasn't directly related to pregnancy, but it felt as if there was something around that kind of parenthood. So policies which had a different impact on people because of their status as parents. So, parents' evenings always being particularly late nights, for example. And I think, we're really urging schools to just think about the impact of policies, because a lot of indirect discrimination is not actually intended. It's just leaders doing things in a way which suits their life or their circumstances. And quite often when that behaviour is pointed out, leaders say, oh, you're absolutely right. Let's make some changes here. So I think discrimination is not often intended in school.
Just reminded me of, so my husband's school last year, every one of their parents' evenings was on a Thursday night. And I was just like, but and it was every, late night was a Thursday night. And sometimes it was like 3 weeks on the trot was a Thursday. And I said to him, no, like you need to go to your school and say to them, because we had my kids do a club on a Thursday night, and childcare wise, we were like, the onus goes directly on me. And then I had a parents' evening on a Thursday night as well. And then it was like, well, who's going to look after the kids? So like your school need to be responsible in looking at, and that was indirect, because you're right. When he pointed it out, they were like, oh yeah, we didn't even think of it like that. And he was like, well, yeah, because I can't do that because our childcare is not going to be okay. And my wife's a teacher as well, and it's just not going to work for us. And he basically asked them to, when they're doing the calendar the year after, to make sure that the days were varied for the late nights so that it didn't impact, because he was actually saying that it's not just parents that it impacted, it was part-time members of staff, for example.
Absolutely.
And because he said, what if you're a part-time member of staff and you work on a Thursday? That means you're doing all of these extra kind of late nights that a part-time member of staff that doesn't work on a Thursday never has to do. So he was like, it's not just parents that it was impacting everybody. So he was saying, the actually it's just not fair. And that was completely indirect, but you're right, it was a massive impact on care. And
I think we need to be really clear that in some cases this behaviour wouldn't constitute legal discrimination, whether direct or indirect.
Yeah.
But it's unfair behaviour, which you know has a different impact on different members of staff. And like you say, it's absolutely not just parents.
Yeah,
You know, what if someone is they have a regular class at the gym on a Thursday night, you know, and that's why we talk about family friendly schools and life friendly schools, because everyone's entitled to have a life outside work. And whatever your commitment is on a Thursday evening, if parents' evening's always on a Thursday evening, that's going to have an impact on you and not other people.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, we spoke with Emma about the you know, the life friendly schools. It's important to note that it's not just parents. We're talking about anybody, you know, anybody that has a life outside of school, which should be every single teacher. And you know, we're not just teachers. We are so many other kind of facets of our being rather than just being a teacher. And it's important to recognize that. And one thing, like me and Jenny discuss quite a lot, is how can a school really think about the well-being of teachers and like how those teachers can be taken care of, because a lot of the time, and we have spoken about this on a previous podcast, that sometimes it's almost like tokenistic gestures of well-being rather than actually thinking genuinely about the policies that they're putting in place and the calendar things and everything else. And even like what you were saying about, yeah, basically saying to somebody, oh, don't come to this training because you're not going to be here. I mean, I could probably think back and think things like that happened to me, and I didn't even think about it as discrimination because it's indirect.
Flo's chapter was all about working parenthood. All four of us are obviously have been navigating working parenthood in various forms. Both Roxy and I have talked about kind of our models of work in kind of previous episodes. So the first thing that I wanted to ask, in your chapter, you talk about the fact that research shows only about 8% of teachers think that flexible working applications are encouraged in the workplace. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on why you think that's the case. So why do so many teachers kind of fear putting in a flexible working application? Why do they think it's not going to be encouraged?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, really, and I don't think I really thought about it in terms of flexible working before I became a parent either, because it just seemed like the precedent around flexible working, in my own kind of limited understanding to start with, was just around kind of part-time hours and going down in terms of going down to like 0.6 or 0.8, and I think there's something to be said about our collective understanding of what flexible working actually looks like, and not just for people applying, but also for schools and school leaders, about what that does look like, and the fact that we've got so many options now. I think one of the things that COVID did do was open up the precedent for what flexible working can look like, and the fact that you can have compressed hours and you can look at working from home during PPAs. And actually what was really nice when I was kind of researching that chapter was hearing so many different forms through case studies of how different schools have offered different types of flexible working. And I think it's just that knowledge, isn't it? Not understanding. So one of the case studies that I mentioned in the chapter was an executive head teacher, and he offers to parents who come back off parental leave the option of having a contract, for example, on 0.8, but actually working 0.6 for 3 days a week, and then having PPAs on that fourth day, so that you still get paid for that fourth day, but you're actually in work for those 3 days, and like just being flexible around those things. I work with colleagues right now, and they have built into their 2-weekly timetable, they've got afternoons that are just dedicated to them actually working from home, because the school is understanding that pickups and drop-offs, as you know, can be really, really tricky depending on situations around wraparound care. And so I just think that there just has to be more done. Personally, that's just what I think about the fact there just has to be more done around educating not just those who are on parental leave looking for flexible working opportunities, but our actual employers, but what is available and what works. Because I also think that unhelpfully, sometimes having conversations could be also off-putting for people because of a culture that can build up in certain education environments around for example, roles and TLRs, and the fact that precedent, I've heard that word so many times, even for myself, it hasn't been set around someone who has that particular TLR to be able to do a job share, for example. And there are just so many workarounds and so many opportunities that I think people are kind of missing out on. And, you know, again, the research shows, the DFE study shows that being or offering flexible working isn't just great for well-being, but actually it is a form of recruitment as well. If you're willing to show that level of that willingness to explore the options, you're going to be naturally a more attractive employer that people are wanting to go and visit,
and to stay at as well, to retain staff as well.
Absolutely. And I think also part of that, I would argue, is also the advertisement around that. And I know that Emma's done loads of work at the MTPT project around kind of flexible working schools and having that kind of advertised in jobs. Because again, there's still kind of limitations around that. And I myself personally, I've been really lucky that actually I've had opportunities where I've had conversations having applied for what was advertised as a full-time role, and in both of the conversations that I then had during interview, we were able to kind of have a really open and honest conversation about what that would look like on flexible working as well. But again, it's the advertising that I think in certain areas is missing, and then on the other side of it, I think there's that fear around applying as well for opportunities, because there might just not be a culture around it, or even knowing where to start having that conversation. And that's why things like the MTPT project and having so many role models and hearing about case studies and seeing how it is working is really, really important for people that are coming back into or looking for jobs, coming back into education. So I think precedent is hugely important to be able to kind of break those stereotypes around what flexible working looks like and what actually flexible working is, because I think those two don't always marry up with each other.
But I think, like, you've been quite lucky to have to be. I'm just not that kind of person. Like me and Jenny have spoken about this quite a lot. Like, I am not a ballsy person when it comes to like talking about these types of things. That's definitely my downfall when it comes to, and we're talking about things like pay, flexible working, you know, all these like stigmatized topics that people that don't really want to speak about. And I think it's really nice that I'm able to hear these really positive stories, because I'm not going to lie, I genuinely, before kind of starting this podcast, before speaking to Jenny, I think Jenny's probably one of the only people I know that is flexibly working as a parent. And I've got lots of examples of other friends that are teachers that have asked for flexible working and been shut down completely, or that conversation hasn't even been open to discussion. You know, I had an ex-colleague who she asked to just pick up her son from school every day. Okay, she was only going to have to leave, I think it was like 15 minutes earlier or something like that. It wasn't even like that much earlier, like at the end of the school day. And they agreed to it with a caveat of she would go down to something like 0.6 or something like that. I don't know, but her pay was dramatically going to come down for leaving 15 minutes early to pick up her son from school. And I was just like, oh God. And then in the end, they actually just denied the whole application. Like, they basically said, no, you can't have, and she ended up leaving the school and going to a school that was able to have that conversation. And you're right, for staff retention, Jenny, like, absolutely, I am more willing to stay at my current school knowing that my head teacher is way more like family friendly. I have never felt uncomfortable asking him to go to my child's nativity play or like go and to a doctor's appointment for my kid or whatever. Whereas in my old school, I would have never asked.
I think it's really difficult if you I guess one of my kind of follow-up questions from this is, you might be someone that's currently listening to this and you're on maternity leave or paternity leave, shared parental leave, and you want to ask for flexible working, but it isn't common in your school. Maybe you don't have many peers that have done it. So I guess I'm just thinking, for those people, what do they do? So for me, for 3 out of 4 of us, obviously we knew about the NCPT project. I got some coaching during maternity leave. I worked at a school that did not embrace flexible working. So there was not a single teacher in the entire school that was part-time. And then I put in an application, but my application was having had conversations with my coach. I got a free employment solicitor because I just found out there was going to be a free employment solicitor in my town. I wrote a 5,000 word application. And then my head teacher said, "You've legally made it very hard for me to say no." And I said, "I know I have." So then I got what I wanted, but that was a big struggle. That was a lot of work, and that took a lot of confidence from me, but also a lot of support from peers and the MTP project. So I guess for people that feel like they're in a school that they don't feel like it's family friendly, and maybe they don't have friends that have already, you know, kind of pioneered that path, what kind of would you suggest to people if there's someone on maternity leave wanting to put in flexible working, but they don't really know where to start?
So on both of my maternity leaves, I applied for new jobs at different schools. So I've had very different kind of experiences, and I feel like, so kind of going back to what you were saying, Roxy, about feeling like having to be ballsy. I'm not naturally a ballsy person, if that's, you know, if that's an analogy. I think I have had to I think I'm really lucky with the role models that I found for myself in the MTPT project and Women Ed as well. And I think wanting to, and feeling driven by the fact that if no one else is going to be that role model in that school, then it has to be me. And I'm not putting that on myself, like I'm carrying that weight, but that sense of like, someone's got to set precedent, otherwise like it will never change, and things will never change, and things will never move forward for men and women who want flexible working. So going back to your original question, in my when I was applying for my first job, the role was for lead practitioner. It was advertised full-time, and I literally just asked to go and visit the school, and I left my she was baby then, I left my eldest with my husband, and I walked around the school, and while I was walking around the school, just naturally having conversations with that member of SLT, and said, "How could you get here so quickly to come and visit?" And I was like, "Well, I'm on maternity leave." And so that opened that conversation about, okay, so what sort of hours would you be looking for? Like, okay, well, I think maybe I'll probably be looking at something like 0.6, 0.8. I'd definitely be looking at like part-time in terms of hours, because again, I wasn't quite aware of like the different flexible working options, because flexible working in all of my years at that point of teaching, 5 years or something, was just fewer days at work. And then just having that conversation, and then at the end just saying, okay, thank you, and I think I'm going to apply. And then when I sent in my application, I said thank you for like letting me come and visit. And because I'd already had that conversation with a member of SLT, they then had previously had that conversation, or follow-up, sorry, they'd had that conversation with the head teacher. And so when I then turned up to interview, it was one of the natural questions that did come up, because he brought it up because I'd already mentioned it. So he said, I can't remember what he said something along the lines of I hear from so and so that you might be looking at 0.6. And so I said, yeah, would that be possible? And he was like, I think we can make that work. And it was setting the ground with that first one. Something that I picked up as well, having read Kat Howard's book about Stop Talking About Wellbeing, is that it's not just them looking at what they want from you, but you are in a really powerful position. You can decide whether or not that culture of that school is good for you. When you're kind of when you're like new into the profession, you don't necessarily, or I didn't necessarily think I had a choice in terms of what job I'd go into. It's just, I need a job, I'll go from this school to this school, whatever. And again, like, as a mum now, I'm just like, no, they have to, like, the place that I want to work at, I have to feel like are invested in me as much as I'm invested in them. And it's that two-way street. It's having that culture and building that relationship and owning that from the very start, because if you set that foundation from the offset, then I think it puts you in a good position to have conversations later, because they know your context and you know them well.
Yeah. And that links in perfectly to our next podcast that we've actually already filmed, but it will come chronologically after this one, where we talk about going for interview and about kind of doing a pre-visit if you can, or a phone call, and about asking those questions. So yeah, I would urge people to kind of have a listen to that one as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like it's hopefully it's inspired people that are maybe feeling scared about the process, that actually being honest from the start actually is really useful. And also just this idea that we talked about this in another episode, you are in a powerful position, like, you're good at your job, they want you, so therefore it's a two-way process. So I think it's really good to hear that message again. And Roxy, did you have one more question as well?
So for Claire, I just wanted to ask, so I guess that actually links to what Flo was talking about. What can schools do to actually support with people that are planning for a family? So like, once you're already in a school and maybe you haven't got children, or you are kind of planning to have a family yourself, or adopt or foster, or there's so many different ways obviously to kind of approach that. How can a school, or what can a school do to help people in that situation?
I think lots of the things are actually really similar to the flexible working conversation, because it's that thing, you don't know what's on offer, and so people don't necessarily ask for things, or they just make assumptions that everything will be fine, because it seems a reasonable assumption to make that if your partner's pregnant, then you'll be entitled to paid time off to accompany them to appointments. And the law states that you're allowed 2 days unpaid leave to accompany your partner to appointments. Now, I had a very, very straightforward pregnancy with no complications until right at the end, and not very serious complications then at all. I had loads more than 2 appointments. And, if my partner had only been able to come to 2 of those and they were unpaid, and in, some cases that will mean that people can't accompany their partner for financial reasons, that's really poor, actually. And I think schools need to remember that they can go further than the law. They don't have to fulfill their legal obligations. They can exceed them. And in a time when recruitment and retention is really, really difficult, that's a really good way of making yourself attractive as an employer.
Yeah.
And it's really good that you mentioned, different ways of starting a family, because there's this there are lots of cultural myths, right, about pregnancy and things. And one of them is just that, it's really easy to get pregnant. And it's it's laughed about. We talk a lot about, accidental pregnancies and people not knowing they were pregnant, and, how easy it is for some people to get pregnant. And yeah, that is the case sometimes, but that's not most people's experience. You might have a heterosexual couple who have been trying for a baby for a really, really long time, and that can take a toll on people's emotions, and that can be very difficult. That may result in needing to use IVF. Could be queer couples who have to start the process by using donor eggs or donor sperm, perhaps a surrogate. There's all sorts of different considerations. Some people want to adopt, some people might be looking at fostering, which again is a totally different thing from parenthood in a traditional sense. And far more people today are choosing to do things like co-parenting with people that they're not in a relationship with by choice, or single, parenting solo. There's so many different options. But if you look at schools' policies, there'll be a maternity policy and there'll be an adoption policy, and that's pretty much it. And it results in some really silly situations. So women who have a wife or a partner who's had a baby have to take paternity leave, because that's what it's called when you're the non-birthing parent who takes 2 weeks off, and that's really silly. I don't want to have to take paternity leave. I don't identify as a man. That's not what I want to be doing.
It's very gendered language, isn't it?
It is, and this is a big thing with the book, that it's one of the most inclusive books in terms of the use of gender neutral language that I've ever read, that isn't specifically about that. There are loads and loads of really inclusive books because, they're around LGBT relationships, or they're around gender or things like that. But, this is a book that is about everyone.
I feel like it then comes down, it basically ends up being subjective to the head teacher, like who the head teacher is, depends on what kind of conversation that you can have. Whereas I've had, a head teacher that was absolutely not open to any type of flexible working, life friendly, anything. And then I've had multiple different head teachers which they're totally open to this conversation, like you were saying when you went to those visits to those schools. And so in a way it's quite a hard one, actually, because in a way, is it better to have it where a head teacher can almost influence that in their own school, which then could open up lots of different opportunities for lots of different people, or should it be kind of standardized into something where it is in a policy, and then it then could become legal, and then you can obviously fight legally for those rights as well. So I don't know, it's really interesting conversation. Like I've said this in a previous podcast, I've said it to Jenny before, I done literally the bog standard like maternity leave, my husband done the bog standard paternity leave. I didn't even know these things existed. I just didn't know. I didn't know, and I never asked for it. And I had 2 kids. I had 3 miscarriages, and I went through a lot of stuff, and I had a lot of appointments and I just never even thought to myself, oh, yeah, okay, I could ask for flexible working, or maybe I don't need to go back, or maybe I could ask for my PPA to be in the morning so I can drop my kids to school. Like I never crossed my mind. And I do think it's such an important conversation for people that are going to be future parents, or people that are current parents, or even people that aren't even parents but just want a life-friendly situation in their workplace. I think that's fair.
I think what I'd say is, if you can, absolutely push for it to be in policy, because then the policy's there. And whilst policies are reviewed on a regular cycle, it would be quite a callous thing to do to say, actually, I've come in as a new head teacher somewhere and I'm going to get rid of our policy, which entitles staff to an enhanced level of paid time off to go to medical appointments for IVF, for example. If once something's there, you might say, okay, we're not going to change this policy, but it would be rare that people would look at it and say, do you know what, let's get rid of all these family friendly policies that we know, our staff are relying on. So although statutory policy, there isn't much of it, I think push for those family friendly policies in your school, because once they're there, they're going to help so many people and they're not likely to be taken away as easily.
So for people that haven't listened before, I've heard in advance what Claire's Get in the Bin is going to be, and it actually links very nicely to what we're talking about. So we each week put something in the bin that we think isn't good practice in the education sector, and then we replace it with our Go for the Win. So over to you, Claire.
I'm going to put policies which don't cover every member of your staff in the bin. There, you know, you might not think so, but there will be queer staff in your school. There will be staff who are having fertility issues. And if you don't know those things, it's probably because you're not creating a culture and environment where people want to share. So put those policies in the bin and replace them with flexible policies which mean that everyone can imagine themselves as a parent and as a supported parent in your schools, if that's what they choose to do.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed having this conversation. Obviously, it's the first time I'm meeting you guys. I know Jenny's spoken so highly about both of you. And yeah, it's just been actually a great conversation to have. And I hope whoever listens really just takes on board that this, you know, these things are ever changing. They're not something that there's not things that are set in stone, even though we're kind of made to believe they are set in stone. So I feel like it's a really important conversation to keep on at and just keep on going.
Yeah, and I would say as well, we're talking about for people that feel like they would have to be the trailblazers. We've mentioned MTP Project, we've mentioned Women Ed. Flo, I don't know if you've got your copy of the book that you can just show, just so people can see a visual of what the book looks like. Yeah. So that has 10 chapters in it, covering the entire process from kind of thinking about planning for a family all the way up to if you know, teaching and parenting isn't for you and you decide to do something else, which was my chapter, but then I came back into teaching. So obviously you can get the family friendly schools that you look for. There is a way. I came back and I'm very happy. So yeah, I'd urge you to buy the book. In the show notes, so many great organisations and different things are referred to. So I'll put all that in the show notes for people to have a look at, and you can see that wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.